This last video will serve as a review for exam 3, the final exam, which will be non-cumulative, although there will be one question that we talked about in the first section on Nietzsche. So remember, just some things to, we'll start with Girard and work our way backwards to Kant. Remember, for Girard, religion and the scapegoat mechanism are designed to control human violence, and they control it with violence. That's the point. Scapegoating is violent. It persecutes... Here you go, buddy. Scapegoating is violent in itself. It's using violence to control violence. It just, minimizes violence by putting all the violence on one person. Where are you going? Come on. Okay. You stand right here. Okay, so for Girard, the scapegoat mechanism controls human violence with violence, the violence of scapegoating, okay? And remember, the only thing that exposes this and overcomes this is, for Girard, Judeo-Christianity, particularly Christianity. Christianity overcomes the mythic violent sacred and argues that the real holy or the real divine that is revealed by Jesus and by the Jewish scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures in the New Testament is a non-violent God, a God who, rather than fighting back, takes violence on himself. And, after he's murdered by humanity, what does he do at the resurrection appearances? He doesn't come back with anger, but he says peace, shalom, right? So Christianity develops an ethic out of this, an ethic in exposing the scapegoat mechanism, exposing the violence of the scapegoat mechanism. It reveals not only the true character of God, but an ethic, namely an ethic of concern for victims, the oppressed, the persecuted. And this makes Girard very, very similar to Nietzsche. Remember, for Nietzsche, there's two perspectives. There's the perspective of the masters and the perspective of the slaves, out of which we philosophize or create ethics. For Girard, those things just get translated into the perspective of the persecuting mob, the Dionysian mob, is what Girard would say, or the victims. And Christianity and Judeo-Christianity allows for an ethical perspective and a religious perspective to come out of the victim's perspective. And he's affirming that, by the way. Okay, so, and remember, all of this, what does it mean? What is the scapegoat mechanism? Just to return to that point for a second, the scapegoat mechanism is the way to control violence by mobbing and collectively lynching an innocent person so as to cathartically purge our pent-up frustrations wrought by mimetic desire. What's mimetic desire? Well, said in the other videos, mimetic desire is very simply the desire that we learn from other people, that we imitate. We learn our desires from other people. Desires are different from needs for Girard. A need is something we all have, but a desire is something we learn. And the problem is we learn it from a model who eventually becomes, oops, you dropped that, a model who eventually becomes an obstacle to that desire. So the very person we learn the desire through becomes an impediment to reaching that desire, becomes a way of thwarting that desire. So mimetic desire is always frustrated because the model becomes a competitor, and that leads to conflict and eventually violence. Where are you going, buddy? Okay. So that's pretty much it for Girard. Make sure you look at chapter 13 on the modern concern for victims. Also check out, for your own interest, FYI, the section on Nietzsche right after that, chapter 14, Nietzsche and the Dionysian. Okay, sorry I had to remove Coco, he was being too loud. One more thing I want to mention about Girard is the way in which he thinks the Christian concern for victims can be abused in our modern world, ever since really the 20th century, or even, well, probably before that. In particular, this is in chapter 14 of the book on Nietzsche and the concern for victims, and he's agreeing with Nietzsche, just not wholeheartedly, namely that when the modern concern for victims does not forego violence, when it pursues concern for victims, concerns for oppression and the persecuted with the use of violence, it inevitably binds itself or rebinds itself to the scapegoat mechanism, the very thing it was designed to overcome. And what you get is an ultra-parodic, that is a parody of Christianity, a hyper-Christianity, where the concern for victims is now used to persecute or you victimize perceived victimizers with violence, if need be. And this is he calls it the Antichrist, because what it does is it takes the concern for victims and then binds it again to scapegoating and persecution. And so it's when you use the concern to scapegoat. It's a problem for Girard, and he sees it in the 20th century, particularly with the communist regimes that often persecuted perceived victimizers. For example, the kulaks in Ukraine, where people who were perceived to have, some kind of, social standing, some kind of bourgeoisie status, and therefore perceived to be victimizers, were killed in the name of the poor or in the name of victims. And so Girard says we have to be very careful about that in the 20th century. And what we see in the 20th century is a repudiation of the victim ethic altogether with Nazism, which says let the weak die off, right? That's the radical, might say right wing version of a return to the mythic, where it just renounces Christianity, renounces Judeo-Christianity, and says concern for victims are beneath us, we need to have power, will to power, etc. That's the Nietzschean version. On the other hand, what you might call the left version of it is to use that concern for victims, but to use violence with it. And that's very dangerous for Girard, because it gets something right while also getting something wrong. What it gets right is we need to care about victims and the persecuted and the oppressed, but what it gets wrong is violence. And when you have violence, you inevitably have scapegoating for Girard. Moving on to Kant for the review. We said Kant's deontological approach to ethics emphasizes duty, and duty so much so that all other sentiments need to be transcended, except the sentiment of respect, because respect is a purely moral feeling. Respect for the dignity of a person is the only moral sentiment. It's not really a moral sentiment, it's a pure moral sentiment for Kant. But even more so than compassion. And ethics can't be based out of compassion. It has to be based on respect for the dignity of a person, respect for the moral law, respect for persons. Okay, so it's very important that even compassion is trumped by the moral feeling of respect for the moral law and respect for persons. Okay. Remember, for Kant, he's a deontologist who argues for the intrinsic worth, value, dignity of people, and largely because we have freedom and free choice. And never, under any circumstances, would Kant argue that human beings should be treated as a means to an end, right? We're always treated as an end in itself and never merely as a means. You can be, under certain circumstances, treat other people as a means, but not as a mere means, and that's the importance. You obviously, when you go to the grocery store, you treat the cashier as a means to paying, but if you treat them as a mere object, then that's a violation of the moral law for Kant. Okay, and remember the distinction too between an action done in mere conformity with duty versus an action done for the sake of duty. Kant thinks only an action done for the sake of duty, not in mere conformity with duty, is morally praiseworthy. Only an action done only an action done for the sake of duty is one that's morally praiseworthy. Right? If I give money to the homeless just so I'll appear good, and I don't have the right intention, namely respect for their dignity, that's not a morally praiseworthy action. Okay. Also, to remember the versions of the categorical imperative. One is always acts so that you treat human beings as an end in themselves and never merely as means. Right? Another version of it is never act unless I can will that my maxim or my action or my subjective principle of the will, never act unless I can will that maxim be a universal law. In other words, never act unless I can picture everybody doing it. Okay? What else? Review. I think that's about it. Remember now, of course, deontology is to be contrasted with utilitarianism. Deontology is a duty-based ethics, whereas utilitarianism or consequentialism is a consequence-based ethics. In other words, what utilitarians would do is say, okay, act so that my action leads to the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which means sometimes the end can justify the means, right? Which is antithetical to a duty-based ethics of deontology. Okay? One last thing. Oh, of course, then for Kant, his book, The Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, is all about searching for the supreme moral principle, the supreme ground or Grund for all moral judgments, reasonings, decisions, etc. Anytime what is it that's presupposed? What axiom is presupposed before I enter into the moral arena? And that axiom, of course, is dignity, or the moral law, whatever you want to call it, this metaphysical principle. Okay? Also, this metaphysical principle, which is dignity, which gets articulated as the moral law, means that since it's metaphysical, this means for Kant that morality is inextricably bound, again, with the religious, because both deal with the metaphysical realms. They're non-empirical, they're metaphysical, as in metaphysica, beyond the physical. Morality cannot be sensed. I can't sense human dignity. It's not a physical concept, it's a metaphysical concept. Once you admit of a metaphysical concept, you're already in the arena of God and religion, and this explains why for Kant that these things are often conflated together. Okay, I think that's it.